technicalities of that case. I'm joined by Anna Bradshaw, a partner at the firm Peter and Peter in the United Kingdom. Thank you for being with us on France 24. First of all, how common is it for Britain to extradite people to the United States?
The normal rule is that extradition requests from the United States will be granted. Obviously, there are exceptions to this, but there would have to be fairly extraordinary circumstances for an extradition request to be denied. There are limited grounds under the UK's extradition legislation that allow you to successfully resist extradition, and they would include technical legal arguments about whether the offence that you're being wanted for amounts to an offence under UK law. Separately from that, they would involve arguments that are very specific to the person being requested. Is the person being sought for improper motives? So, for example, if he is wanted on the basis of his political opinions, then that is a bar to his extradition. If the person would suffer violations of his human rights if extradited, then that would be a bar to his extradition. And also if the person's extradition would be oppressive by reason of his health, mental or physical health, that would potentially be a reason to resist extradition. That's not an exhaustive list, but those are classic examples of the arguments that are typically made.
Does it make any difference that Assange is an Australian citizen?
No, not in this case. Some countries do refuse to extradite their own nationals, but the UK does not and has not ever refused to extradite its own nationals. And here it's obviously irrelevant because Julian Assange is not a British national.
To what extent does it help the US government's case that it has currently good relations with the British government, in that British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government is more favourable to Donald Trump's government than say, another Prime Minister? Does that make a difference, or is this completely separate from politics?
In theory, it should be irrelevant. In theory, it should be an independent decision by a judge to extradite Julian Assange. It will, after the judge rules, if it does rule, that he can be extradited, it will pass then at that stage to the Secretary of State. But even though the Secretary of State technically orders the extradition, the grounds on which she can resist extradition are very circumscribed and set by law. So even at that stage, it doesn't become a fully political decision. Having said that, one extraordinary aspect about this case is the amount of opinions that are wading into the debate globally, touching everything from press freedoms to human rights protections that relate to torture. It's going to be very interesting indeed to see how the extradition process can be perceived to be independent of that wider political position. I fear it will be hard to resist the perception that it can be influenced.
This case has been dragging on for a decade now. Looking back, it would appear, wouldn't it, that Assange might have been taking a lesser risk had he cooperated with the Swedish authorities and been extradited to Sweden, which of course he spent a lot of time hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy in order to avoid that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's always easy to be wise with the benefit of hindsight, but I think here in Julian's case, it's not easy to say what would have been the better course of action. There is, as I understand it, some reference now by his defense team to the fact that it took the US authorities so long to ask for his extradition, and that fact is relied on to support the suggestion that it's politically motivated. That may well be something that would have been harder to argue if the extradition request had been made earlier, but who knows? And the problem that Julian has as a result of seeking refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy is, of course, that he can't rely necessarily on the passage of time, because that passage of time is of his own making. And as he found out to his detriment last year, the fact that he skipped bail meant obviously that he had to serve a sentence of imprisonment in the UK, but it also means that he will inevitably be perceived as a high flight risk, which means that the prospects of him being released on bail, pending appeal, for example, are slim indeed.
Anna Bradshaw, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.